Today's episode of DawgNation Daily is brought to you by Kroger, fresh for everyone.
Presented by DawgNation.com, this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. Here's your host, Brandon Adams.
And welcome in, everybody. DawgNation Daily, daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented by Kroger. Once again, working our way back to something that sort of feels like the normal version of this show, as you've come to expect it since, August of 2015, or on video, going back to spring of 2017. We've been doing this now for quite some time, been dealing with some issues, but boy, we're working our way back towards something that feels a little bit more normal. If you're watching on video, hopefully you notice it sort of looks a little bit more normal. Hopefully the sound of things will be a little bit more normal today here as well. So we are just really happy to have all of you on all of that. And one of the things we're going to get into in a pretty heavy dose here coming up a little bit, Georgia made another addition in the transfer portal yesterday, and it was another wide receiver. This has become a little bit of a trend for Georgia in recent years, adding receivers in the transfer portal. We're going to talk about what that means and specifically what Georgia might be getting in the person of Michael Jackson, obviously a very famous name. We'll try to avoid some of the puns associated with the King of Pop here and do this more along the lines of an actual football conversation as it relates to Michael Jackson here coming up in just a couple of moments. Prior to that, I want to go back in time here, at least just for a little bit, but I do so with a specific purpose in mind. It's about looking ahead to the future and what the future of college football is going to look like, and the understanding of how, if you're Georgia or if you're Georgia within the SEC, how both this program and this conference operates in the new landscape we're about to see here. I think that's an important discussion to have. And one of the things that you notice is, and this is just the nature of college football fans, but one of the things you notice is that the argument about who should and shouldn't have been in the college football playoff, that continues to linger. There are a lot of Florida State fans who are mad. They feel like Alabama's loss to Michigan is proof that Florida State should have been there. I think that, frankly, there's a lot of Georgia fans who are still sort of talking about the fact that, hey, this pretty clearly was one of the four best teams. Winning by 60 points in the bowl game would seem to be proof of something. It's not the end-all, be-all, because obviously we know that bowl games are a little a different sort of separate entity from the rest of the regular season. But at the same time, we're also not going to insult your intelligence and act like when you win a game by 60 points, it's not indicative of something. What we've said before is that game between Georgia and Florida State was just proof of a difference, that there is a difference between the top teams in the SEC and the top teams in the ACC. And that difference does make a distinction that's supposed to matter. And moving forward, that difference has got to be respected. And we don't really feel like it was respected enough coming into this year's college football playoff discussion. So I want to spend a second on, okay, well, what does that mean now for the future here? I want to start with, I'm going to go back to Monday. SEC Commissioner Greg Sankey from Pasadena was on the Paul Feinbaum show. And in discussing the kind of landscape around all of this as it relates to college football, Sankey kind of once again doubled down in his belief that the team that actually should have been the college football playoff among the four best teams was Georgia. But he'd also apparently, according to what he told Paul Feinbaum, cautioning both Georgia and Alabama, the two SEC teams in the potential discussion for the playoff, about how to behave if for some reason they were excluded. I think this is interesting, especially in contrast to everything we've seen from Florida State. I think it sets us up for where we need to go today. Let me let you hear from Monday SEC Commissioner Greg Sankey on the Paul Feinbaum show from Pasadena. This is what Sankey said.
On Sunday morning, after our championship game, I didn't know. I didn't know if the answer to the question you asked me and you and Ryan asked me that I was asked on game day, will this be the first year there's no SEC team in? Now, if I'm asked that question, the wrong answer is, oh, yeah, that could happen. I'm certainly not going to say that. We had a statement prepared from our office that would have said we're disappointed. We have a different view of who belonged in the 4-team college football playoff. And by the way, I think Georgia was one of the four best teams through the season. I still do. The committee has to make decisions, but what we weren't going to do is point fingers and inflame a situation. I had conversations with Georgia and Alabama that if both were left out, and obviously one was, that where we weren't going to say, it's this inflammatory thing, it's bad for college football, it's wrong. That's the system that everyone agreed to participate in.
So obviously what Greg Sankey's doing there is, in addition to making the case for Georgia, kind of pointing out the contrast for what he thought was, I think, distasteful behavior on the part of Florida State, which we'll get to here in a moment. But as far as the other point here about the fact that, hey, looking around, Sankey once again saying, I do believe that Georgia should have been in the college football playoff. There's clearly some data that boosts that point that Sankey's trying to make. Many of you saw this. The Hard Rock Sports book down in South Florida put out some information this week that if Georgia were to be playing either of the two teams playing for the national championship on Monday, that's either Washington or Michigan, Georgia would be the favorite over both. As you see there, they'd be at a 2.5-point favorite against Michigan. They'd be a 6.5-point favorite against Washington. So this idea that Georgia should have been in the top four, well, certainly the sports book, sports betting data seems to back that up. Nick Saban told us a year ago that's the thing that ought to matter more than anything else is who's favored over whom. So from that standpoint, as the Hard Rock points out, perhaps Georgia should have been in the college football playoff. And it certainly speaks to the fact that it's ridiculous that not only was Georgia not in the top four, not only was Georgia not in the college football playoff, they were actually ranked into bowl season 6 behind the Florida State team they end up beating by 60 points, opt-outs or not. Now, by now, you certainly understand that all of this is very well-traveled ground. This discussion of whether or not Georgia should or shouldn't have been in the playoff, we've all kind of had our turn to discuss all of that right now, and the behavior of Florida State. The aftermath of all of this has gotten plenty of discussion too. So you may be wondering, okay, well, why bring this back up right now? I think it's really important to understand a couple of things here moving forward. I think it's really important to sort of understand what time it is, to use a phrase that you sometimes hear these days. That for as distasteful as it seems like Florida State has behaved, incessant whining, petulant, we'll take our ball and go home, essentially, not even trying, it appeared, in the Orange Bowl, content to be embarrassed with a little more than a shrug about all of that. At the very least, I believe that Florida State seems to understand that when it comes to what's about to happen in college football, that there is nothing more important than arguing your own case. There is nothing more important than taking very seriously the idea of what is in our own best interest, and therefore taking your fist, pounding it on the table in the hopes of getting your own best interest to be the sort of prevailing argument of the day. Now, in the case of Florida State, there's a very simple and easy reason why they're able to do that. Because Florida State's not a part of the financial windfall that the rest of the sport is enjoying, or at least much of the rest of the sport is enjoying. SEC teams, Big Ten teams are making a lot more money than Florida State is. So therefore, the only thing Florida State really has is a competitive opportunity on the field. And so therefore, that's what they're arguing for. But moving forward, this is where you're going to be really careful if you're the SEC, because I got to tell you, there's a part of what Greg Sankey says there that makes me a little bit nervous. Sankey says, hey, we believe that Georgia should have been one of the 4 best teams, but we also caution Georgia that if things were to go wrong, to basically be, careful about how you argue that, and remember this is the deal we all made, and this is the agreement we all made here. Basically saying, hey, don't be such a squeaky wheel that you hurt the overall objective, which is to make as much money as we possibly can. And look, I realize this is a certain naive level of thinking. It's a little bit of a pie-in-the-sky type approach, whatever else. But if I'm Georgia, my response back to Greg Sankey on that would be, our goal is not to be a part of the absolute biggest business possible in college football. Our goal is to still win games. Our goal is to still win championships. And you'd love for Georgia to sort of view that as more important than just being in unanimous agreement on, a system that's obviously enriching programs in the SEC and programs in the Big Ten. Sankey, to me, seems to be a little bit too much of a defender of the system in this case, because the system's obviously enriching a lot of people, the SEC programs included, and perhaps not enough of a defender of an SEC team that perhaps feels like it should have been in the college football playoff. And what's weird about that is that when you want to go back to the time in which the SEC was moving sort of under the cover of darkness, much to the surprise of many, to add Texas and Oklahoma, at that point in time, Sankey's sticking out his chest, and he's SEC. He's conference pride, sort of bragging on what the SEC was willing to do to take these 2 programs away. But now that that's done, the financial part of this is taken care of, his message to Georgia or Alabama, if it would have been left out, is, hey, we need to all get along here because there's a lot of money to be made by our unanimity on all of this. And, I don't like that necessarily. I still think the competitive part of college football ought to matter. And frankly, I think it ought to matter to most of us more than the whole business part of this does. But it sort of sounds like to me, on the basis of that statement, Sankey's a lot more interested in the business concerns than he is the actual competitive concerns. And I hope that's not, where all this moves to. And I'd say the same thing, frankly, to a degree about Kirby Smart, who, after the Orange Bowl, I would say argued more forcefully for some sort of system change that made things a little easier on Florida State with the opt-outs. I'd say that Kirby's argument on behalf of Florida State was a lot more forceful than his argument was on behalf of his own team after the SEC championship. And y'all, that's not the way this is going to be moving forward. We're about to enter into an era in college football where there's not less arguing, there's more arguing. There is a 12-team playoff that's about to occur, and we're going to have 3 layers of arguing moving forward. We're going to be arguing about who makes the college football playoff. In other words, the difference between the number 12 team and the number 13 team. But within the confines of who makes the playoff, the next layer of argument is who gets a chance to have one of those 4 byes, and who gets a chance to skip one round of the playoff and move on to the quarterfinals. And of the 8 teams after that, who gets a chance to host one of those playoff games, and who gets a chance and has to endure the chance of going on the road for one of those playoff games. You're essentially gifting one team 3 points in a battle against another when it comes to hosting a game versus going on the road. The overall value of being at home is that much, and that's a part of the debate going forward. And I still don't know for sure if college football fully understands the nature of that debate. There is a very big difference, we would say, between the best of the SEC and the best of the ACC. And in the case of, like, say, Alabama compared to Florida State, it seems like that difference was respected. In the case of Georgia compared to Florida State, I'm not quite so sure that difference was respected. In fact, we know it wasn't. Georgia was excluded from the playoff and ranked below Florida State in the last CFP ranking, but Florida State happened to be undefeated, and Georgia happened to have 1 loss after winning 29 straight games. But that pays no attention to the fact that Florida State plays in a lesser league, a league that does not play on the same level as the SEC or perhaps the Big Ten, which has got 2 future teams in this year's national championship game. So my point here simply is that if you're Greg Sankey speaking on the Feinbaum Show, or if you're Kirby Smart speaking after the game in terms of, concern for Florida State and its issues with the opt-outs and things like that, I think everybody involved in college athletics, the head coach, the conference commissioners, the athletic directors, everybody who has sort of a vested interest in their own success, I think they've got to be ready to argue that case going forward. I think you've got to be ready to kind of roll up your sleeves and do battle. And you can say that Florida State has been distasteful, and they almost seem willing to kind of blow up the entire system, or at least put the entire system in jeopardy as a way of kind of getting what they think is best for them. And I know that's the kind of thing that makes them pretty unpopular, and I get that. But there's also an element to which I sort of respect the idea that they're not working to save college football right now. They're working to save themselves. And there is something to be said about having an idea of what is in your own best interest and working to get that, and not worrying so much about working together to make the sport as financially lucrative as it can possibly be, or as big a business it can possibly be. There's something to be said about taking care of your own best interest, and Florida State seems to be doing that right now. And I would say that for Georgia and the other SEC teams, understanding what that's all about moving forward, I think it's going to be a pretty important next step. My name is Brandon, and this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented today by Kroger. And we have been working very, very hard around here, and I certainly appreciate a lot of people who've been doing a lot of stuff to sort of get this show kind of back to normal. We've had all kinds of issues behind the scenes here. I won't bore you with all the details on that. You're probably aware of many of that. We've had a lot of folks working very hard to kind of get us back to where we need to be. Boy, it is a great pleasure to be able to do some of that again today. I'm sort of pushing some more buttons in a way than I ever have before, but we're having a good time with all of that, and we certainly appreciate you being here and being a part of it, and we appreciate our friends at Kroger being a part of all this there as well. Longtime friends of ours here on DawgNation Daily, and man, they have got really fun and good stuff coming up for you here in the brand new year. I want to tell you about something Kroger Chef Jr. You've heard me talk about this before. Your first chance to experience Kroger Chef Jr. for 2024 takes place tomorrow, and that's going to be a great time. This month, the Kroger Chef Jr. menu item is chicken salad. You can enjoy that tomorrow. There's also a chance to be a part of this on January 20th as well at select Kroger locations. And the great thing about this guided kids cooking experience is it's just $7 per child. So if you go to the website, KrogerChefJr.com, that's the word junior spelled out, Junior, KrogerChefJr.com. You can find out about the participating locations near you that are doing Kroger Chef Jr. here this month. And you can find out how you can get an apron, a patch, a chef's hat, and a special for your child, plus be a part of making some chicken salad, which is a lot of fun. KrogerChefJr.com for more on that. That is KrogerChefJr.com for more on that. All right. Here on DawgNation Daily, presented by Kroger here today. Coming up in a couple of minutes, we've got Connor Riley pinch hitting for our normal Friday guest, Jeff Sintel. Jeff is out and traveling, so we'll catch up with Jeff, I'm assuming, sometime soon. I haven't had Jeff on the show a ton lately, but we'll catch up with him coming up in the near future, I know for a fact. But it's actually a great day to have Connor on the show because Connor's written a couple of very interesting pieces at DawgNation recently, DawgNation.com. One of those involving the recent transfer wide receiver to Georgia, Michael Jackson. In fact, to sort of step in and preview that discussion, let's get ready to go around the doghouse right now, poured today by our friends at the Finished Long Drink. And I'm going to try my best to avoid any sort of king of pop related puns on all of this. But nonetheless, Georgia did add another transfer receiver yesterday, their second of this cycle. London Humphreys obviously coming in there as well. And you see the graphic from Michael Jackson yesterday, celebrating his arrival from USC to the University of Georgia. By the way, we've got some news I'll get to here in just a second as it relates to another Georgia Bulldog. We'll get to that here coming up in a second. But Jackson on his way to the University of Georgia, becoming the second transfer wide receiver for Georgia here in this cycle. And I think it sets up something pretty interesting about Georgia and the wide receiver position. And before I get to that, let me just go ahead and give you this update here. So Nazir Stackhouse, this is the news we were hoping for. Stackhouse had kind of teased this a little bit on Instagram. And, we're kind of in that time of year where there's live news sort of breaking as the show's going on. We do have this nice-looking graphic coming from Nazir Stackhouse says, I am running it back and I'm returning to Georgia for 2024. Great job by our folks there behind the scenes to get this out on the screen. And really good news here in just as we're doing the show live, the 10 a.m. hour on this Friday. Nazir Stackhouse coming back to Georgia for 2024. That's exciting news. Big boost to the Georgia defensive line. This is a group that obviously is going to have high expectations here next year, and having a veteran player like Stackhouse returning is the kind of thing that I think Georgia fans ought to celebrate, because if you need ready-made, capable defensive linemen, the likes of Nazir Stackhouse, not easy to find those in the transfer portal, and certainly not easy to find those right now from the high school ranks. So Stackhouse coming back is a big deal. This is not totally unexpected. It's been sort of hinted as a possibility. We'll wait and see if Warren Brinson chooses to join him. But there had been some hope that the Nazir Stackhouse might come back, and now he is. So Georgia getting some good news there with its defensive line. We'll do more on that here coming up in just a moment. That is certainly good news. Let me, though, transition back to the news we were planning on talking about, which broke yesterday. And by the way, it's just the, sort of that kind of time around DawgNation right now with stories breaking here left and right, guys making their announcements to either leave or return or something in between. Jackson, the receiver from USC, coming in here. Now, this sort of brings up a couple different questions. Question number one is, okay, well, if you watch some individual highlights, it certainly seems like Jackson's a pretty good player. The overall stat line was not incredibly robust. So how good is Jackson actually for UGA? And that's one of the things that can kind of only be answered by his performance on the field once he gets to Georgia. But sort of broader than that, and perhaps more interesting than that, is what we see from Georgia the last couple of years is a program that has certainly not made the transfer portal a main mechanism for talent acquisition in other position groups. And Kirby Smart's even said as much, that they don't want to use the transfer portal as their main way of acquiring talent. They want to use high school football recruiting as their main way of acquiring talent. But at the receiver position, they have been more than happy to go out and get the transfer receivers. Last year, it's Dominic Lovett and Ra Thomas. This year, it's London Humphreys and Michael Jackson. That Georgia seems willing to do something at the receiver position it's either been unwilling to or just no need to do when it comes to the overall the other position groups. And so I think it's fair to wonder, okay, well, exactly what does that mean? Exactly what is that all about? And I think there's an attempt to sort of jump to kind of the last page on all of this and say, well, is Georgia having to do this as some sort of shortcut? Because this is what we say about other programs. When other programs are really aggressive in the transfer portal, we say about them, well, they're just taking a shortcut here because they were unable to do this when it comes to the high school ranks. And is Georgia only going into the transfer portal because it's proving unable of bringing guys like this in as high school receivers? And in one respect, perhaps that's a little bit of a fair thing to bring up. I would say that it is obvious that all the various position groups on both sides of the ball, offense and defense, the one position group where Georgia's recruiting success has lagged in comparison to these other groups is at wide receiver. This would seem to be a position where Georgia does not play at the same level it plays at the other spots. But let me give you a different way to view that for a moment. Let me kind of flip that perspective on its ear just for a moment. That while it is just obviously true that you run through all the names. I mean, I loved Mike Matthews, the 5-star receiver from Parkview High School. I think he's a great dude. He's a terrific player. I think he's got some intangible qualities. I mean, I'd loved for Mike Matthews to have come to Georgia this year, and that seemed like that conversation never really got off the ground. So that's an example of Georgia just not being able to impress a 5-star receiver the way that it seems to impress 5 stars at other positions. It never really happened. Same thing for like Ryan Wingo or Jeremiah Smith or guys like that, kind of on the line with Luther Burden, but ultimately Burden chose to go to Missouri. We can cite all these examples, save George Pickens, the one 5-star battle that Georgia did win for a receiver. But we can sort of see all these examples of, Georgia perhaps trying to get involved with the guy, and ultimately that just not really happening. That it certainly seems like Georgia has not, been able to recruit that position as well as other positions. That's just sort of objectively and factually true. But ultimately, I would say that the best way to judge Georgia and the receiver position is not by the raw talent it's brought in, but by the end results the receivers that it does have produced. And this is where I think something really interesting happens, where I would say from an efficiency standpoint, Georgia probably does as well at the receiver position as virtually anything else. And this is a team that was last year 11th in American passing yards per game, tied for 6th in America in yards per pass attempt. Now, a lot of this speaks to the quarterback, but it's still the passing attack overall. By the way, that yards per attempt number tied Georgia with USC, who had the Heisman Trophy winner and has this history of great passing attack. But on a yards per attempt number, Georgia and USC were the exact same last year. Passing touchdowns last year, Georgia a little worse in that category, but still 18th best in America. So I think the actual vantage point to view the receiver position from is not the raw materials that Georgia's bringing in, but the end results those receivers are producing. And this continues to be about as efficient a position group as exists based on what Georgia is getting out of the talent that it has. I think that matters. I'm going to talk more about why it does here coming up in a moment. Connor Riley is ready to join us for that. But prior to that, let me remind you that this is Around the Doghouse, poured today by the Finished Long Drink here on DawgNation Daily. And as you roll in towards the weekend, I am looking forward to a weekend. I'm not going to lie to you. I am ready for a fun week.
The year LSU won national championship, I think 95% of the snaps were 3 receivers, and there were 3 really good receivers. So, you play the players that give you a chance to play. We have a bar, and we say this is winning football above it, and this is losing football below it. And if you can play winning football, then we're going to give you opportunities and chances to play based on what you have shown us. And we got some guys that can play winning football. We probably got 6 or 7. We probably got 3 or 4 that are right on the line that aren't playing winning football yet, that we're going to try to get ready. So
Finland
that's
the summer games back in Helsinki in the 1950s, been in America now for a few years, been in Georgia now for a little while there as well, and just enjoy what has been a big part of our Dog Nation lives for a long time here, the Finished Long Drink. Make sure you try some of that. The Finished Long Drink pouring around the doghouse for us here today. Now, with that said, let me bring Connor Riley into this discussion here right now, because Connor, first of all, thank you for being here in place of Jess Sintel here today, but also in the furtherance of the discussion about Michael Jackson as a receiver, and then we'll get to the Nazir Stackhouse stuff too. There's a lot going on here right now. Let me start with this. Before we get into what this means and what it represents, the sort of larger picture here, how about Jackson individually as a player? How good do you think he is?
I think at worst he's a depth piece, a guy that can come in, has played high-level football before, and this is a Georgia wide receiver room that just needs bodies. They're losing at least 6 guys right now, 4 to the transfer portal, 2 to the NFL draft. And when you get a guy that has played at a high level, that has played in a high-functioning offense before, I think you have to go out there and take that. I know he can help out as a punt returner as well, though. I still expect Anthony Evans to be the guy at that position for Georgia. So I think at the bare minimum, this is a quality depth add for Georgia in terms of what they're going to be getting at the wide receiver position. I think and there were certainly some people scratching their heads about this, given Jackson went into the portal early on in the process, took an early visit to Georgia the same weekend that London Humphreys and Xavier McLeod committed. I think if Georgia knew that it was going to get a better wide receiver out of the transfer portal at this stage in the process, it would have already done so. And so there's some familiarity here. Jackson played for a member on Georgia's staff, David Hill, when he was out at Desert Pines High School, the same high school that Darnell Washington played at. So there's some familiarity here. And Georgia, I think, knew somewhat of what it was getting. And when it comes to the transfer portal, where the hit rate is maybe only about 50% in terms of, getting a guy that can come in and help you, when you have a guy variables and coming in, especially with Dante Williams being the former defensive backs coach at USC, I think the familiarity that existed there was why he was a take at this point in time to help out this team in 2024.
So you wrote a story the other day at DawgNation.com about this, I guess it would have been yesterday, that I think is really interesting about how, Georgia's essentially taking more transfer receivers right now than it is actual high school wide receivers. And my response to that is that as long as the results are good, I sort of don't care. I mean, we've gotten used to seeing Georgia go out and get 5-star this and 5-star that. At the receiver position, they don't really swim in those waters. And I think we kind of understand why Georgia gets negatively recruited against when it comes to wide receiver. That's become a very pricey, position in NIL, we're led to believe. Georgia perhaps not quite as willing to be as aggressive on the front end as some programs are. So therefore, Georgia is just kind of going after a little bit more of economic choice when it comes to the receiver position, economic-based choice when it comes to the receiver position. But as long as the results have Georgia near the best in the country in the overall passing attack, I think that's actually something to commend Georgia for, as opposed to something to be critical of Georgia for. I'm not saying you're being critical, but for some fans, they're kind of wondering, okay, when does the breakthrough occur? I would say, given the fact that there's sort of a scarcity of resources for all college teams, that as long as the results are like this, I'm not quite so sure that Georgia needs to recruit a better caliber of receiver out of high school anymore, and that going out and getting the sort of transfer receiver that can kind of come in and be a part of this, that actually may just be just fine.
Yeah, I think you're right in looking at this. If this is part of a whole economic pie here, and I understand we might start losing some people talking about economics and whatnot, I certainly see your point with that there. I will say, look, I thought the receivers struggled to separate in the loss against Alabama. Now, Alabama does have two NFL caliber starting cornerbacks in Terrion Arnold and Kool-Aid McKinstry. You're not going to see that on a week in, week out basis. But when Brock Bowers and Ladd McConkey were compromised in that game, I just felt the rest of the Georgia wide receivers struggled to really get open and create separation. Now you're losing, they were your two top wide receivers for a reason. I think if that's true for most teams, you're going to see them struggle in that point. And look, we have seen Georgia still, I think, go out and try and build through the recruiting ranks. You've seen Kirby Smart. He's come out and said as much. We want to build all position groups through the recruiting ranks, and you do have guys that can come in and play early. Dylan Bell did that, A.D. Mitchell, Jermaine Burton, George Pickens. But I think, as you point out, we've sort of seen Georgia go maybe about this Moneyball-esque situation when it comes to wide receiver. They're just not going to spend big. I think that's part of the reason they didn't end up landing Nikar, a one-time commitment in this class. They also don't end up adding Mike Matthews, a five-star prospect, who I think you and I agree is right up there with the most talented high school players in the country this season. Mm-hmm. So, and while you would love to have those guys, look, Georgia feels comfortable in terms of what it's going to be able to find out of the transfer portal, because say what you want about it, and there are certain positions, I think defensive line, offensive line, and cornerback, secondary, that are going to be tough to consistently get good players out of. Wide receiver, that's not the case. You're going to be able to go in and find good players at that position, I think, every single cycle. I know Georgia really likes what it has done in Humphreys. I think what interests me more is Michael Jackson of USC and Colby Young of Miami. Those are one-year players. That is not traditionally what Georgia has done. Also, they do not come from SEC schools. Yes, USC and Miami are big-time programs, but they're not exactly SEC caliber. And so I think with that in mind, I do think that this signals maybe Georgia pushing a little bit more of its chips into the 2024 season. Michael Jackson and Colby Young have a chance taking away reps from, say, a guy like Tyler Williams. And so long term, that might, make you wonder a little bit about what the future of this wide receiver position is. I think it's a clear sign, and this is something you and I have talked about before. I think college football now is becoming much more of a 1 year at a time sport. And the additions of Jackson and Young, who are both 1 year players, who are both coming to play with Carson Beck for one more season, who himself is coming back to Georgia for one more season, I think only furthers this idea that we're just going to have to take this thing 1 year at a time. I think the wide receiver position is really the first one to show that. But I think as we get further and further out from the rest of college football, you're going to see more and more teams sort of look at this in terms of patching up certain holes on their roster.
I also believe this, that we've kind of reached peak talent level for the very best teams in the country. I think Alabama this year was like the 90%, like 4 and 5 star, like the highest level it's ever been or something like that. I think moving forward, the idea that you win a national championship by having like 11 5-stars in offense, 11 5-stars in defense, and just literally obliterating your competition, I don't think that's the nature of the sport going forward because A, NIL is pricey, B, there's freedom of movement for players, and so therefore a lot of guys congregating on one team, that just may not be the easiest thing to do anymore. It may feel more like the NFL, and like you said, we kind of lose people when you kind of get into like salary cap economics and things like that. But NFL teams have gotten used to this for a long time. If you've got the very expensive quarterback, then you've got to be okay with just good somewhere else, guys who are probably exceeding expectations other places. You can't have a million Patrick Mahomes in your roster. If you've got Patrick Mahomes, that means you've got to go a little cheaper somewhere else. And for Georgia to go less heralded transfer wide receivers because statistically speaking that's working, to me, that may be for me a little bit more in keeping with what college football is about to be.
At one, I mean, you can look at this Monday national championship game. Washington has 0 5-star players on it. Michigan has not had a top 5 recruiting class. It's the first time in a while 2 things are going to be broken in terms of no top 5 recruiting class in the last 5 seasons and without a true generational quarterback. I like J.J. McCarthy, but he's not what Cam Newton or Trevor Lawrence were. And then Washington is even further anomaly. I'm not even 100% sure if they are a team that meets the blue chip ratio threshold, which we had thought for a long time had sort of been an indicator of who can win a national championship. But when you have Michael Penix there and you've identified the talent that they have and developed the talent they have at that wide receiver room, it helps you cover up for a lot of things. I think the NFL analogy that I want to sort of build off that you just made, and the Chiefs maybe are a great example this year because they're struggling for a number of reasons, not just because the wide receiver room is bad. In the NFL, you're going to have the best teams have elite players at a number of positions. But I think what separates the teams, it's their ability to, yes, you obviously have great players in certain spots, but it's can you be league average at spots that you don't deem worthy of donating your resources towards. It's, like the Philadelphia Eagles, in my mind, are a perfect example of this. They've prioritized their offensive line and their defensive line and their wide receivers, and that's great. But what's really, I think, weighing them down are their linebackers and safeties are among the worst in the NFL. And if those guys are merely just average, as opposed to being the worst at what they do, I think that changes the way we view this team here. And so going forward, to your larger point, it's not so much about having the greatest strength and raw numbers. Ohio State and Alabama signed the number 1 and 2 recruiting classes in that 2021 recruiting cycle when you and I spent a lot of time talking about this. In terms of just going out and getting national guys, those were the only 2 teams that were doing it because they were just able to lean back on what they had done for the past decade. Since those classes have come in, Alabama has won 1 playoff game. Ohio State has won 0. I think that only further demonstrates the way that this is all sort of changing. And obviously, look, they're going to get another crack next year and there'll be more playoff games. But I think going forward, the goal isn't just total talent accumulation. It's managing, at the areas we're not great at, how do we find just enough to still be good there without sacrificing what makes us great at other areas on this roster?
As we've been doing the show here today, the news has come out that Nazir Stackhouse is returning to Georgia for 2024. I think this is really good news for Georgia. We'll kind of move to the next phase of our conversation by bringing this up. I think this is really good news for Georgia. Total candor. This is not to me the same thing as like Cedric Von Pron coming back last year or Nolan Smith or Jordan Davis coming back in previous years prior to that. I don't put the same category of, boy, that's the difference maker that changes everything. But it certainly makes the Georgia defensive line deeper and therefore better for this upcoming season. I guess we'll await, Warren Brinson, who perhaps could make the same decision that Stackhouse has officially made here right now. But I do believe the Stackhouse news should be supported by Georgia fans. I think that it will. At the very least, he gives Georgia an experienced, capable player back on the defensive line for next season. You can never have too many of those.
One, I think if you get Stackhouse and Brinson back, you get the combo of them. I do think that's a Jordan Davis level-esque return or Nolan Smith level-esque return there. And I think the big thing to know with Nas, who one of my favorite interviews, great player, a guy who had an NFL draft round grade, I think probably would have been a third, fourth round pick had he elected to declare. But you get him back. He played more snaps in 12 games this year than Jordan Davis played in 15 games in the 2021 season. And so just by simply getting him back for another year, he doesn't necessarily need to get better, though. I know he's going to work hard and do all the things that he needs to do so. Getting him back, it frees up a lot of other stuff, and it gives you more depth in that defensive line, particularly in the middle of the defensive line where, if he goes pro, Georgia's probably relying a lot on guys like Jordan Hall and Jamal Jarrett who haven't played a ton at that, sort of nose tackle position. And so to get him back, I think this frees guys like Christian Miller up to do more things. Jordan Hall is obviously another player to know there in the middle of the defense. And if you bring back Warren Brinson as well, you get closer to, I think, what made those Georgia defensive lines in 2021 and 2022 truly elite. Yes, obviously they had impact players like Jalen Carter and Trayvon Walker. It was a strength in numbers that I think really overwhelmed teams when you're able to have a guy like, say, Jalen Carter come in fresh off the bench. If you're able to do that this coming year and keep guys like Christian Miller fresh and keep guys like Jordan Hall fresh, I think that's going to further help what you're able to do defensively. And we can be honest here. I think the biggest reason that this 2023 team didn't necessarily get to a national championship is just because I think that defensive front seven, which you saw Michigan, I think really had its way with Alabama, just wasn't quite up to par with what Georgia had in past seasons. Getting Stackhouse back for another season, getting Warren Brinson potentially back for another season, already bringing back linebacker Shmuel Munden for another season, getting those types of NFL players to come back. I mean, Mel Kiper put out his NFL draft rankings today and still had Shmuel ranked as the number 5 inside linebacker prospect. Getting those types of guys to come back where, I think at certain positions, running back, wide receiver, maybe even cornerback, you can come in and play a little bit. But having adults in the middle of that defense on the offensive line as well there, I think can't be understated enough. And for the way that Georgia wants to play and would love to play, I think getting those guys to come back for another season is absolutely massive.
Okay, so let's try to round this up then. Transfer portal window has closed, unless there's some sort of straggling paperwork. It seems like it's over and done with for Georgia. You mentioned Benson. That's a big deal to pair with Stackhouse. Georgia fans hoping for that. Online chatter about Xavier Truss. What else is still out there for Georgia right now? Are we holding our breaths, if you're a Georgia fan, on the wide receivers, rah-rah and love it, or is that kind of put to bed now? What else is still out there for Georgia fans to be worried about over the course of this weekend?
Yeah, worry might not be the word that I would use at this point, but to monitor moving forward, I think the 3 wide receivers, Arian Smith, Ra Thomas, and Dominic Lovett, do they all officially elect to come back for next season? I would say the answer to that question is yes right now, though I do wonder if maybe the addition of Michael Jackson maybe indicates something in particular for Arian Smith if he elects to move on and go somewhere else. I do think as well, Truss and Ratledge are interesting. I think Georgia likes what they have in Micah Morris and Dylan Fairchild, but when you bring back guys that have that level of starting experience, and you saw this year on the offensive line how injuries can so quickly impact and shake things around, have guys that can play multiple positions. In Truss's case, a guy that was a second-team All-American in Ratledge's, absolutely take those guys if they elect to come back. So I think it's all, obviously we're starting on Warren Brinson here as well to make his decision in terms of the NFL draft. They're not going to have to make that official until Monday, December 15th. So potentially we've got a whole nother week of this. But for the most part, the players that aren't going to be on Georgia's roster next year have already left the program, and we're getting a much more clear picture of what this team is going to look like and what this roster is going to look like. And even before guys like Ratledge, Truss, and Lovett all announced they're coming back, a lot of people still see Georgia as the number 1 team to start the country next season.
Very, very interesting. One final thing to get to before we let you go, and I'm just disappointed. I mean, I just feel like that, I don't know. So the debate this week is after the decision by Brock Bowers to move on the NFL, and obviously Bowers will leave Georgia as one of the all-time great players in program history. I feel like one of those things that we were actually on pretty early, having him sort of recognized as an all-time great at a time in which, maybe not everybody else was fully on board. Well, now everybody sort of sees that for Bowers, but, leave it to the young generations where take things too far. Connor this week at DawgNation.com making the case for Bowers as the greatest Georgia player of all time. want to be serious about this just for a second. I do not believe that you can compare the Bowers numbers to the Herschel Walker numbers because of the entirely different era that exists for the sport. And I think that you're a big enough sports fan. I think you understand context around eras and things like that. I just think the Herschel era is just so different. And frankly, you know how I feel about this. There's also, I think been an intentional attempt to erase the legacy of Herschel Walker as a football player. And I just think that's a part of this. I'm not saying you're doing that, but I think that has been a part of this. Herschel was only the number 2 all-time great player when this came out. Was it 2019 it came out, whereas historically it always been viewed as number 1. I do believe there's been a little bit of a Herschel Walker erasure that's gone on in recent years, and that matters to me. And so therefore, I can have Bowers as my second greatest Georgia player of all time, but I can't have him as best player of all time because Herschel Walker is the greatest Georgia player of all time. You obviously made your argument on the other side of that earlier this week, so I give you a chance to sort of make your case.
Yeah, I guess my follow-up to you, obviously we can't take numbers into this. Herschel Walker had 5 times the amount of touches that Brock Bowers did. I think that it was obviously always going to skew it in a certain way there. I mean, I'd point out, Quinshon Judkins has replicated numbers pretty close to what Herschel Walker has done these last 2 seasons. And look, football is a team game. This is not an individual game. I think the way basketball perhaps is, where we talk about GOATs so often. It's not swimming, it's not tennis, etc., things like that. You look at the impact they had on the team in terms of scoring touchdowns. Brock Bowers was better at that on a per play rate than Herschel Walker was. Brock scored a touchdown 1 every 6 times he touched the ball. Herschel Walker scored a touchdown 1 every 19 times he touched the ball. Herschel Walker, in his time at Georgia went 33-3. In games that Brock Bowers played at Georgia, they went 38-2. And at the end of the day, the thing that I come down to, Brock Bowers was the best offensive player on the 2021 national championship team and the 2022 national championship team. Brock Bowers won 2 national championships at Georgia. Herschel Walker won 1. And I know that is a team award there as well, but at the end of the day, for a player that has defined winning, that has defined the true golden age of college football, where I believe it is harder today to win the national championship than it was necessarily in the early part of the 1980s, I think that tips it in favor of Brock Bowers, in my opinion.
All right, let me do 2 things, then we'll wrap this up. In response to that, there's no doubt that Brock has played on better teams. Like the 1980 team is not in the same category of dominance. If you had a computer simulation where you could play like Madden-style games, there's no way 1980 beats 2021, even sort of, I guess, adjusted for differences in eras. The 1980 team, relative to its competition, is not as dominant as the 2021 team or 2022 teams were relative to its competition in that era. I totally acknowledge much better teams that Brock Bowers played on. But my sort of last argument in favor of Herschel, and I realize this is difficult to quantify, but I just believe this is genuinely true. There is just something to be said for doing what Herschel did when everybody in the building knew he was getting the football, when the entirety of the defense, when every fan in the stands, when everybody knew Herschel was getting the ball. It's like the old line, I think they used to say this, Ricky Henderson. There's a difference between stealing bases and being a base stealer. Anybody can steal a base, but a base stealer is getting a lead at first base and stealing second, even when the catcher knows that you're about to go and you still get it. That's just what Herschel Walker was. He was the guy that just put up the numbers that he put up, even with the full knowledge of everybody in the stadium that he was going to be the guy that touched it. And that, to me, is what makes him sort of to me, he's like a Ruthian figure in the sport. He's almost defying, comparison to anybody else here. And I do think that just even with the passage of time, it becomes difficult to remember that. Even if it's not, some other factor involved here, with the passage of time, it becomes difficult to remember that. And I think that Georgia ought to do more to sort of celebrate its greatness of the past, because I think it becomes an easy thing to forget if you're not careful. And, I think it's a fun conversation. I just like any kind of debate like this. I think they're fun. But in the case of remembering things that happened 40 years ago or things that happened 100 years ago, I do think that's an important thing to do, because history gets lost to time if you're not careful. And I do not, Connor, want the Herschel legacy to get lost to time.
I think that's fair, and I would agree that I don't think that Georgia has done a good enough job honoring its all-time greats, in particular Herschel Walker here. Obviously, I think with some of his political comments and political-minded things, he is absolutely tainted in some people's minds, his legacy overall. What he did as a Georgia football player absolutely deserves to be recognized and commended. It's interesting to me you bring up Babe Ruth, who was famously playing against and longshoremen. Look, I'm just saying the quality of athletes is not the same in 1980 as they are today. Herschel Walker was probably playing against frat stars and future investment or insurance salesmen, whereas, Brock Bowers out here playing against grown men in the SEC week in, week out basis. The SEC is a better league. They're playing better teams. They're playing Ohio State and beating them. And I will say, to your point about when everyone in the stadium knows he's getting the ball, look, Brock Bowers did that too. You think to the Auburn game this year, you think his touchdown in the 2022 national championship game, the game is still on the line there and Georgia was only up by a point. The fourth down play he made against Ohio State in the college football playoff semifinal 2022. In my mind, in these last couple of years, when Georgia has needed to give someone the football to make a play and the other defense knows who that is, Brock Bowers has been that guy, and more often than not, he certainly delivered in those situations.
Just know this, I will never forgive you for making me argue against Brock Bowers on something. I just want you to understand, I will never forgive you for putting me in that position. But I do enjoy the discussion. I appreciate that. And Connor, I know you've had a lot of great stuff here as of late, looking at all the roster moves that Georgia makes as it continues to try to, keep pace and put together a championship contending team for 2024. So always fun to be able to do all of that. Connor, have a great weekend, and we'll look forward to speaking to you. Listen, your regular day or when somebody can't be here, whatever else, you're always ready for us, and I certainly appreciate that. We will look forward to talking to you soon.
Yeah, just throw up the bat signal and I'll be there. As always, it was a pleasure, BA.
Let's take a look around the rest of the league. This SEC through.
Good stuff from Connor Riley indeed there on the Brock Bowers stuff and everything else. Obviously, Nazir Stackhouse coming back to Georgia. That's good news for today. The arrival of Michael Jackson as a transfer wide receiver. That's also good news there, too. So a lot of good things going on with UGA here right now, and you love all of that. And speaking of good things, there's also plenty of good things going when it comes to Royal Caribbean there as well. Exciting stuff for 2024, including the debut of Icon of the Seas. In a couple of weeks, I get a chance to be on board that ship. I can't wait for that. It's going to be an incredible, incredible experience and so much fun. And I can't wait to come back and tell you all about it. But the thing I can tell you about right now is your chance to be on board yourself comes with my friend Jessica Slater, great travel agent, selected for us by Royal Caribbean. You can give her a call, 770-718-9147. That's 770-718-9147. You can also email her, jslater@dreamvacations.com. She'll tell you everything you need to know about being on board this massive cruise, completely redefining what it means to take a cruise vacation. Largest water park at sea. Unbelievable, new restaurant concepts, and especially lounges on board. Entertainment options, the likes of which have never been experienced anywhere else. And one of the things that Royal Caribbean really does a great job of is kind of redefining, what it means to be entertained on a cruise ship with the great Broadway-style shows, the aqua theater, high diving, acrobatic type stuff that goes on, the ice skating shows, things like that. My kids in particular love the ice skating shows. They've just always gravitated towards those anytime we're on a Royal Caribbean cruise ship. So you get a chance to experience the same thing too. And by the way, speaking of big for 2024, how about the DawgNation cruise on board an Oasis-class cruise ship here this year? Allure of the Seas. And we are on the real countdown for this. It's going to be here before you know it. Once again, I can help you out with all of that. Want to see you on board. Hundreds of you have already signed up to be a part of it, and more of you still have your chance to do that in the weeks to come here. So please check out a website that Jessica's put together. It's called RoyalDawgs.com. RoyalDawgs.com. Dogs, of course, spelled the way that it's supposed to be. DAWGS, and you can be on board the DawgNation cruise with us here coming up. All right, a couple of SEC through stories to get to for you here. Starting with surprise news yesterday. Quinshon Judkins, the terrific Ole Miss running back, put his name in the transfer portal. Now, there is a lot about this that I think is very interesting, primarily the fact that it seemed like all the momentum for Ohio State all the momentum for Ole Miss had been around who they're at the transfer portal. Go out and getting this guy and getting that guy. Perhaps most prominently Walter Nolan, but there have been others. Also guys around Ole Miss that were successful in 2023, staying for 2024. Wide receiver Trey Harris, Jackson Dart, the quarterback most prominently. And then after all of this momentum for Ole Miss in the transfer portal, lo and behold, probably the most recognizable name from the Ole Miss roster this season, Quinshon Judkins, just sort of out of nowhere announces that he's going into the transfer portal right near the deadline for Ole Miss players to do that. Now, fair to wonder, okay, well, what is going on here? First of all, it's interesting that Lane Kiffin was on some sort of fishing trip. There was all kinds of social media from him yesterday on fishing trip, I believe he's in the Bahamas. speaking of Royal Caribbean, but I believe he's in the Bahamas fishing, so you're kind of left to wonder how aware of he was he of all this, because he was out fishing when the Judkins news dropped. There was a very cryptic message on Instagram from Ole Miss quarterback Dart using a Tom Brady quote, essentially about the idea of selfish players, selfish teammates. It seemed like that was a little bit of a jab in the direction of Judkins. So pretty clearly there's some angst here in the Ole Miss program about Judkins making the decision that he's making, and all any of us can do is speculate about this. But this is the speculation I'm willing to offer you here. It certainly appears to me that Ole Miss might be doing a little bit of what you sometimes see in the NFL. We've talked several times today about the way in which college football rosters are being constructed, maybe a little bit more similar moving forward to the way that NFL rosters are being constructed. And what do you know about the running back position in the NFL? It just has less value than it used to have. And for Ole Miss, it's pretty clearly spending pretty big as it relates to some transfer portal players, high-value defensive linemen, things along things of that nature, edge rusher like Prince Uleman from Florida, that the running back position, given the finite financial resources that any program has, may just not be worth quite as much. And Quinshon Judkins may be saying, well, you're giving X dollars to this quarterback to stay here, and you're giving X dollars to all these transfers to come here. How about me? You see the numbers that I'm putting up? I want to get mine. And he probably feels like he has more value in the open market, perhaps, that he does. But every program moving forward is going to have to make some very tough decisions about who they really want to work to fight to keep. In the past, college football has been about relational relationships when it comes to players, but we're about to probably move into a little more of a transactional age, which is, what is your finite value in comparison to the money that I might have to pay to keep you or the money I might have to pay to get you. And if you're Lane Kiffin, who has a history of producing good running backs, no matter where he's been calling plays for, he may just feel like that he can find value at the running back position with a less pricey player than what Quinshon Judkins might feel like he's in the open market. And I hope that Judkins is making a proper evaluation of his own value. Perhaps somebody somewhere is going to give him a big deal if he wants to go in the transfer portal, but keep this in mind. If a team pays you big dollars to come run the football for them, are they going to want to let you limit your carries? Are they going to want to let you save yourself for the NFL where you have a chance to make even more money? It would stand to reason that teams make a big financial investment in you to come play for their college team. They may want to get the most out of you while you're playing for that college team, and they may not be quite as concerned as you are about saving yourself for the future in the NFL here. So we're going to see a guy like Judkins perhaps bet on himself by the transfer portal, and we're going to have to sort of see how all that works out. Now, I'll also say this, and I don't take great pleasure in saying this, but there's also an element in which if you want to bring some sanity back into the current NIL age in which we live, oftentimes free markets are about winners and losers. Occasionally, you're going to have to let some guys fail. And occasionally, you're going to have to let some guys sort of bet on themselves and have that not work out in some way or another if you want to kind of produce some sort of sanity back in the market, because not everybody's going to cash in big in a situation in which resources are finite and resources are limited. Some guys are going to cash into a big way and they're going to have their actions greatly rewarded. Other guys are going to make a bet on themselves and it's going to, crap out. That's just kind of the nature of that. Judkins obviously a very good player, but what we're about to find out is for the very best teams, how much do they value a good running back? Is college football becoming a little bit more like the NFL in terms of the belief that, well, you actually might be able to go out and get success, production from a running back that's perhaps not as pricey as the famous player like Quinshon Judkins. I don't wish him ill. I hope for the best for him. And I think it'll be very interesting to see where he lands, and I'm sure there are plenty of good teams that are perhaps interested in a guy who's obviously been so productive. But this might be a reflection of a very modern version of what college football roster management looks like here right now. Speaking of transfers, Ohio State has now added one there as well. His name is Will Howard. He was the quarterback at Kansas State a year ago. And this is all very weird. Look, everything about Ohio State I think right now is really, really strange. Now, I'm obviously not a Buckeye fan, so perhaps you might get the sense that I revel in saying that, and to a certain extent I probably do. But I'm also trying to be as objective as I possibly can. This year, the thing that made Ohio State less than a college football playoff level team, something it had been in 2022 and something it expects to be every single year, the thing that really put Ohio State below that level this year was its quarterback play. 2022, Ohio State had C.J. Stroud. Before that, the program had Justin Fields. Before that, they had, keep going. This is a team that has had very successful quarterback play. This year, Kyle McCord was just not that guy, so much so that the Bucs were more than happy to move on from McCord at the end of the season, and McCord went to Syracuse because it appears to be that's about the level of quarterback Kyle McCord is, just being completely honest. And so it's been obvious that Ohio State has been in need of a transfer quarterback, viewing Kyle McCord as not being good enough, looking to go out there and replace him. And any kind of talk, like, say, Cam Ward, who's kind of viewed to be the number one quarterback in the transfer market, that never really materialized, either because Ward was driving too high of a bargain or because Ohio State didn't, whatever the reason was, that never really happened. So now you're going to a guy like Will Howard, who is a pretty mobile quarterback, probably more mobile than McCord, but not a great player and not a guy whose stat line is obviously better than what McCord's is. In fact, in some respects, is even worse. And Ohio State fans for a month, I realize that fans do, but for a month leading up to that Cotton Bowl game, trying to tell us that Devin Brown was the real answer for the Buckeyes at quarterback. That's the real guy they were waiting for, and we're going to find out how good Devin Brown really is, despite the fact that he couldn't beat out Kyle McCord at any point in time during the year, which didn't make logical sense, but nonetheless, fans don't always lean on logic, and clearly Buckeyes fans had deluded themselves in thinking that Brown was the guy. Well, now after the Cotton Bowl, they know that's not the case, and now you're turning to Will Howard, who is not an obvious upgrade, if an upgrade at all, over Kyle McCord. For a program that's been quarterback dependent, there is some stuff going on quarterback with the Buckeyes. And to add to that, have y'all seen some of the chatter that's been coming out as of late? I think Dave Biddle from 24/7 Sports had some of this kind of stuff, and other Buckeyes players have spoken out about this. The idea that Ohio State allegedly did not use its practice time very well prior to the Cotton Bowl game, that they didn't use all their practices for one thing, but maybe more important than that, the practices they did have were pretty soft. They didn't tackle very much. They weren't playing physical. And, kind of speaking to the sort of finesse style of football that it seems like Ryan Day has sort of preferred, or just a lack of focus for a program right now that seems to be kind of drifting in sort of a listless direction in comparison to rival Michigan, who's playing for a national championship, other teams coming into the Big Ten who have championship aspirations of their own, including the other team in the title game, Washington. This is a very weird time for Ohio State right now. This is not overstated. This is a program that doesn't seem to know what it's going to do at quarterback next year, or at least doesn't seem to have a guarantee that it's going to get better quarterback play in 2024 than it got in 2023. And certainly had a very ugly showing in a bowl game. And some of the whispers coming out of perhaps not exactly putting a nose to the grindstone in terms of preparing for that game. Boy, strange stuff there. A couple of other notes on Alabama here before we wrap up. Terrion Arnold does a weekly interview on, I think it's the Next Round Live. I believe he's on there every week. It kind of must be like an NIL type deal or whatever. So Arnold, who's a very good player, obviously, has said that he sees no indication at all that Saban, to use double negative, is not returning for 2024. The expectation behind the scenes here is that Saban will be back at Alabama next season. And you know how we feel about this. We think that's good news. We think that Nick Saban, and I say this sort of half-kiddingly, but we think that Nick Saban owes it to Georgia to be on the sideline next September when Georgia and Alabama play. It's a really weird thing, but we actually have never seen, in the Kirby Smart era, a battle between Georgia and Alabama in the regular season, in a real season, with a real crowd, with a real week to prepare, kind of real normal circumstances. Georgia and Alabama have never played during the regular season under those conditions in the Kirby Smart era. So Alabama has avoided Georgia in the regular season for every year other than the weird pandemic year, which we know doesn't count. They have avoided Georgia in the regular season every other year in the entirety of the Kirby Smart era. So finally we get, even if it's in Tuscaloosa for the second straight time, we finally get a Georgia and Alabama regular season matchup. So we think that Saban really owes it to Georgia to be on the sideline for that game and giving not just Georgia fans but the entire college football world the sort of regular season matchup that somehow, some way, Alabama's found a way to avoid for all of these years. We think that really Nick Saban owes it to Georgia to be on the sideline for that game. So if what Terrion Arnold is saying, then that's obviously, we would say, good news. Now, speaking of Nick Saban, one final note here. And I have to confess, I just sort of see this the way that I do. So Saban does his, weekly appearance with the Pat McAfee show. A lot of news around the McAfee show here this week. But on the Pat McAfee show. And Saban does not flinch at pointing the finger of blame the direction of his center, Seth McLaughlin, who went into the transfer portal this week after McLaughlin's snap issue in the Rose Bowl game, including in the final play of the game, essentially saying that the low snap prevented the running play that Saban says was called from being successful here. And perhaps that's true. There's no reason to believe that it is. But this to me sort of speaks to Saban going about his business in a way that I just don't believe that Kirby Smart would do. And listen, I realize these are essentially grown men. I'm talking about the players that play this sport. And it's just sort of natural to have high expectations and be critical when those expectations are not met. All of that is just a real thing that happens. We get all of that. But the idea that Saban, if you saw the clip, you know what I'm talking about. The idea that Saban would sit there on the desk at the McAfee show or on the interview screen, the McAfee show, and essentially sort of allow it to be said that McLaughlin cost them the chance to run the play they wanted to run, and he'd had issues all year long, essentially allowing it to be McLaughlin the scapegoat for the Alabama loss. I just think that's kind of gross. I really do. And my question for Nick Saban would be, now Pat McAfee's not going to follow up on this, but my question for Nick Saban would be, well, you're the coach. How come you didn't replace him? Or how come you didn't coach him to be better? I mean, isn't the old adage in coaching that you're either coaching it or allowing it to happen? How come you didn't coach him up not to snap this way? Or how come you continue to allow it to happen and not replace him with someone who's better if you're, such a great, architect of your program? That some of this kind of points back to Saban here a little bit. But in such a tense moment when Alabama lost a game in such a tense way in the final play of the game, for Saban to sort of sit back and relax and allow McLaughlin to take all the, the slings and arrows about all of that, I just think it speaks to something that is obviously and unavoidably true. Saban is truly a great coach, but he is not a good guy. If you put him on trial for being a good guy, you would not have enough evidence to convict him. And I don't care how true it is, the things he's saying about McLaughlin here is center. The idea that he's allowing this young man to take all the blame for the loss, I hope future players who are considering where to play their college football, I hope they are noticing Saban's behavior around this, and we'll make that cruising around the SEC, courtesy of Royal Caribbean. And as we wrap up and get ready to roll into a weekend, we're obviously excited about that. We appreciate your patience as we kind of roll through some things around here. And obviously, invite you to stay close to DawgNation, too. The news that Nazir Stackhouse is returning for 2024. That's up at DawgNation.com. What Georgia's getting in wide receiver Michael Jackson, that is up at DawgNation.com there as well. And as we close things out today, how about a golden shoe? And our buddy Bass and Dog, who's always such a prolific Twitter user or X user, showing us the great photo here from Brock Bowers, the Florida game in 2021, and the amazing catch, and that snapshot there of a ball that's seemingly behind his shoulder. And what Basson says is how Bowers caught this ball, the human mind can never comprehend. And there was so much of that during the Brock Bowers career. Truly just a series of superhuman events it seemed. So truly a worthy golden shoe going the direction of Bass and Dog there on that. And obviously great remembrances of the Brock Bowers career. And how about the lousy, stinking Gators? The team for whom that event happened, it's been 1,154 days since they've beaten Georgia, and Brock Bowers may be gone, but the fortunes for those lousy, stinking Gators, they show no signs of improving. That is our Gator Hater Updater. We will see all of you back here Monday. DawgNation Daily presented by Kroger. We will look forward to talking to you then. And on video, time now for the R.S. Andrews Cool Down. R.S. Andrews, the one you turn to for your air conditioning, heating, and electric needs. They show up on time. They do the work that's promised, the price that's promised. You can trust them on all of that. We are not going to go super long today on comments because I just am about out of gas here. But we're going to have some fun nonetheless for a couple of minutes. I'm going to do this off of YouTube here, but we're going to have a good time. Let us see what else. Nature Gator says, I'm bothered by Alabama destroying my dream scenario this year. He may never get over Saban and Bama beating UGA this year. Well, listen, I'm a fan. I don't mind telling you. I am disappointed about that. Here's the thing. I am secure enough in my own feelings to be totally honest about what my feelings are. Of course I'm disappointed about that. Georgia had a chance to win 3 straight national championships. Now, Florida fans have no idea what that's like. They would just hope to win 3 straight games, and maybe one day Florida get a chance to do that. But, of course, I'd want to win 3 straight championships. And, of course, I was massively disappointed by that not happening. And, we can say that. No reason to hide from that. Of course, hugely disappointed. And, yeah, when you think about the historic accomplishment that could have been, yeah, we'll linger with you there for a little while. That doesn't make anything else less true, though. Let's see what else is going on. A-Dog says, Ask yourself, if Bowers was the only option on UGA's team, would he put up these numbers? No, because teams would just take him away and force others to make plays, but they can't do that with Herschel Walker. I do believe that's true. And I want to be very, very clear about something here for a moment. When I say that, they've just tried to erase Herschel Walker's legacy. I'm not trying to fall in the same sort of trap of political talk you see on other networks or things like that. That's not what I'm trying to do. I think that anytime any athlete sort of veers in the direction of politics, be it left or right, that becomes the kind of thing that divides the audience. I would say, completely different example, look at LeBron James here for a moment. Now, I think all right-thinking people's view Michael Jordan is the true GOAT, but there is an element of, because James has been involved in some political opinions that are obviously the opposite of some of the ones that Herschel Walker would have expressed. I think there's this attempt to sort of diminish LeBron James because he's become a little bit of a political figure in some people's minds. So this is not one of those things that just sort of goes one way. I believe that any person who gets heavily involved in politics on one side or the other probably sees a little bit of their sports career diminished in terms of the opinions that are expressed because of that. But in the case of Herschel Walker, that's no doubt true. I mean, it is objectively true. For a long time, Herschel Walker was sort of thought to be the greatest college player of all time. And the moment that he became a political figure, whether you agree with his politics or not, the moment he became a political figure, suddenly he's not the greatest college player of all time anymore. You can't help but notice that. Let's see what else. Jonathan Aaron. I didn't say anything about Aaron Rodgers on the McAfee show. I did not see it. I don't really have an opinion on it, but I just know it's in the news. Let's see what else. Caleb Myers, the kind of words. So Caleb, it's funny. We were actually talking about this in our first and 15 a little earlier. I always get compliments to this shirt. I always do. I think people like it. It's got a lot of zippers and stitching. It's sort of kind of a little bit of a modern look to it. I always get compliments. I appreciate that, Caleb. Thank you. Some of y'all are doing the list of all-time greats. Garrison got Tebow, Burrow, Tommy Frazier. I mean, I do think that kind of list, you got to make room for Tommy Frazier because that's one of those guys, because he didn't have a big NFL career, people could easily forget about him if you weren't alive to have seen him. Frazier is just an unbelievable player. And ask your boy Nature Getter about that 95 title game. Ask him how he remembers that one. Let's see what else. Jonathan Aaron on the subject of Bill Belichick being out of New England if Jim Harbaugh would get that job. So to me, the issue with Harbaugh in the NFL comes down to, are teams going to be willing to give Harbaugh the level of control it seems like he'd like to have? Now, perhaps a team like New England, who has seen Bill Belichick have a lot of control, although not always to great effect, they might be willing to do that. But it is, as we said, I think we said this during our cool down yesterday, it is obvious that Harbaugh wants to go to the NFL. But it is not obvious that an NFL team is going to offer him terms that are agreeable to him because Harbaugh does not really want a boss. So Harbaugh wants to go to the NFL. I would say it's more likely than not that he will do that this year. Just the fact that he hasn't signed his Michigan contract certainly leads you to believe that he thinks he's going to. But there is still an element that somebody's got to kind of agree to the terms that Harbaugh wants here, which involves a lot of control for him. Now, the flip side of this is, and I don't know what the latest true news reporting on Belichick is, but is there a chance if Belichick is out in New England, could he be the next Falcons coach? I would kind of wonder that for a number of reasons. Let's see what else. David Jackson says of Tim Tebow, he gave a great speech. That's it. Yeah, I mean, look, the Tebow thing is one of those where, on a list of true great players in SEC history, he's got to be in that category, right? I mean, because he had multiple very good years. It's funny, the year he won the Heisman in 2007 was not really as good a year as obviously there was in 2008, 2009. So I mean, you got to give Tebow credit for being a good player. I don't know how high I have him ranked, and frankly, I don't feel the need to overpraise him because there's certainly plenty of people who do that, for sure. Jay Shop's wondering if I'm losing weight or if my head's getting bigger. So I'm not losing weight. If anything, I'm gaining weight. post-Christmas, but we're going to work on that here very soon. We're also using a little bit different camera setup right now, so it probably makes my very big head look even bigger than normal. John Hendricks says there's talk of Todd Monken getting an NFL job. I think there should be. Looks like G. Grace is stirred up in here as per usual. Let me go to the other comment sections here for a moment. Let me pop over to Facebook. On Facebook. That is not it. Hold on. Now we're on Facebook. On Facebook, some comments here. Holcomb says that Herschel got his yards and touchdowns when everyone in the stadium knowing who's getting the ball 8 at the time. Yeah, that to me is the number one argument in favor there. You know, this is still the guy that I believe has the 3 highest single-season rushing totals. His single-season rushing totals were the 3 highest single seasons in Georgia history at a time in which everybody knew he was getting it. As we've said before, that to me is just the number one argument there that, you know, you can't – I don't know that it's possible for any individual player to be as dominant in the modern age as Herschel Walker was in his age. And that's just got to matter. It's just got to matter. It's got to matter. Let's see what else. Matt Rukavina says the mind of the sociopath is incapable of accepting or acknowledging fault, just saying. Yeah, I mean, listen, there are a lot of personality traits that Nick Saban puts on display that I don't find very appealing. Now, you may be like what Nature Gator said before, you're just mad because, Bama beat Georgia in the SEC championship. I'm not happy about that. Of course I'm bothered by that. Of course that's the case. But that doesn't mean the other stuff can't be true, too. William Perry says the new camera makes me look like a bobblehead. We're gonna work on that. We're gonna get all that fixed. Some of that's also I just am a funny looking guy. Like here's the thing I've learned over the course of time because I used to do this. I told you this before. I used to blame the lighting for this, blame the lighting for that. Eventually, you just sort of realize that's how I look, and it's not the light's fault. In this particular case, it's probably not the camera's fault. I mean, y'all, I have a hard time buying a hat off the rack. Like the idea I'm just going to walk into this sporting goods store and slap a lid on top of this, dome here and walk out. They don't make a lot of hats that fit this head very, very easily. So that is part of that's not the camera's fault. Part of that's just my fault. Let's see what else. Craig Jones says that Kirby would never throw one of his players under the bus. He absolutely would not. The way that Alabama had McLaughlin to be turned into the scapegoat for that loss, Kirby Smart would not do that. He just wouldn't. And listen, is Kirby hard on his players behind the scenes? He is. And probably should he be? He probably should be. This is tough business, right? This is not little league left field. Not everybody gets a turn. I do realize all of that. But what Alabama is allowing McLaughlin to face the brunt of, I don't think it's very becoming. Jonathan Moore wants Todd Monken in Atlanta. Well, pretty clearly they need a better offensive coach. And would I turn down the chance to have Monken as Falcons head coach? Probably wouldn't. Do I think that Monken's probably Arthur Blank's cup of tea? I don't know that he is. Now, Arthur Smith is also sort of an abrasive dude. So if you're moving off of Arthur Smith, can you imagine a Todd Monken press conference in Atlanta as the head coach? I don't know that you want to go from one abrasive dude to another. That's kind of a weird thing. But I have very little doubt that Monken could be a better coach than Arthur Smith's proving to be. Let's see what else. Randy Hall wondering if Jay Shipe's head is shrinking because of the brain shrinkage. Yeah, can't say that for sure. William Camacho says that Monken's happy as a head coach, I should say as an offensive coordinator, does not want to be a head coach. I wonder, William. I don't know if that's true or not. I wonder. Jacob O'Neill also says that Blank isn't getting rid of Smith. I would certainly say this. Jacob, I would say that Arthur Blank is looking for every reason to keep Arthur Smith. That's not quite the same thing as saying he definitely is keeping him. But I would probably agree with you that Blank will take every chance he can to find an excuse to keep him. I probably do. Christopher Irving asking any news on Dominic Lovett. No news as of yet. Now, there's also, he doesn't have to make an announcement. He probably will because players seem to like to do that these days. But he doesn't have to make an announcement. I don't have any reason to think that he is going to the NFL, but he certainly has that choice to make. So we talked about this a little earlier, for love it, for rah-rah, for trust. Anybody else? Is that it for now? Those are still the announcements that are forthcoming. Keep in mind, the deadline for the draft's not until the 15th. The portal deadline was this week. The draft deadline's not until the 15th. John Paul Williams says, I think playing one lesser team like Herschel did actually proves he's the better player. He says, easier to perform on a team with better players supporting you. Yeah, I mean, look, Herschel is the all-time great Georgia player, but the 1980 team is not the all-time great Georgia team. Not even close. The level of dominance that Georgia had on both sides of the ball in 2021, probably 2022 as well. If you had some sort of computer simulation where you could play these games, I would make the 2021, 2022 teams huge favorites. That's not just about, the modern athlete's more, athletic. It's about relative to the competition, I believe, these Georgia teams were better than that Georgia team probably was. But that doesn't take anything away from Herschel Walker. As you say, it probably makes it even more impressive. Everything but the SEC was different back then. You're playing 11-game regular seasons. You're only playing 6 conference games, but you were playing pretty much what we would think of as like Power 5 non-conference games in almost all those other games. Like Georgia's playing Clemson every year as a non-conference game. South Carolina every year as a non-conference game. Tech every year as a non-conference game. It's just a really weird schedule back then. Everything was so different. Kevin Cook says Herschel had 40 carries a game, a true workhorse. Yeah, for sure. Kevin also says you can't compare a wide receiver's touchdown catch ratio to a running touchdown carry ratio. I'd say that's true. I don't think the statistical argument works in favor of Bowers compared to Herschel. I don't think that works. If you want to make if you wanted to make the argument for Bowers, I believe here's the argument you'd have to make. It's about the moments. How many true, amazing moments did Herschel Walker have? Now I'm on the record as saying Herschel's the better player, so I'm about to now put on a different hat, contrarian, and argue against my own point. So y'all follow me on this. If you wanted to make the argument for Bowers, I believe the most effective argument are the moments that he was a part of. The dazzling highlights, like the Florida catch we were talking about a moment ago. The Ohio State game where he contorts his body on the 4th down. Is that a better individual moment than anything that Herschel Walker was ever a part of, given the stakes involved? The best individual moment for Herschel, was it running over Bill Bates in his first game? Was that the best individual moment for Herschel Walker? That might, if you're really looking to make the Bowers cases, this is the greatest Georgia player ever. If you're looking to make the case, I think it's about, count the individual moments, the sort of wow factor highlights. Now, Herschel had a lot of those too, jumping over the pile and then flipping and landing on his feet, things like that. So there were some wow factor highlights there too. But in terms of kind of like the clutch moments, weirdly, think about the best individual games that Georgia had during the Herschel era. It's Ballou to Scott in the Florida game of 1980. It's the defensive stand in the Auburn game in 1982. Now, people might come back and say, okay, well, if you're going to sort of cite the Brock performance against Ohio State, how about Herschel playing with a separated shoulder against Notre Dame? And now you're kind of getting back to that again. But I do believe if you wanted to make the Bowers case, I believe you're going to have to really kind of say it's not about numbers that you can measure because 2 different eras, 2 different positions. It's about the moments that matter, the kind of clutch gene moments. Bowers obviously had a ton of those. And I've got no problem saying Brock Bowers is the 2nd greatest Georgia player of all time. I've got no problem saying that. I believe that's probably true. But just logically speaking, Herschel's the greatest college player ever. Well, of course he's the greatest Georgia player ever. Yeah, John Paul Williams says, the Herschel moment, you dive over the pile of the separated shoulder against Notre Dame. Very good point. Very good point. Yeah, really, really strong stuff. Barry Watkins says for him, the top players are Herschel, then Stetson, and Brock. So when we did our top 4 earlier, our Mount Rushmore back during the winter. By the way, we're almost back to Mount Rushmore season again, believe it or not. When we did our Mount Rushmore back in the winter, we had, and to our credit, listen, we got plenty wrong, but we recognized Bowers as an all-time great way before anybody else did. Way, but we were on the eye. We were keyed in on this being a truly special all-time great player, like during his freshman season. I mean, we were fairly attuned to the fact that he was putting up a statistical profile that very few Georgia players had ever put up. We were pretty locked in on this pretty quick. So our Mount Rushmore included Bowers to begin this year. Herschel, Bowers, we said David Pollock, and we also said Nick Chubb. I think the 3 of those are pretty easy. The 3-time All-Americans, Pollock, Bowers, Herschel, are pretty easy. I think the 4th is tricky. And this is where I'm probably guilty of what I accused Connor of doing a little earlier, which is, okay, after all these decades, some feats just get lost to time. Like my grandfather, both my grandfathers really loved Charlie Trippey, but like the Trippey era doesn't mean very much to me. That's the 1940s. And, Frank Sinkwich kind of much the same way. Like it's hard for me to have a lot of context around the 1940s. It just sort of disappears after a while. And, I'm trying to fight against that happening for the Herschel thing, which was, 40, whatever you go. But, when you're talking about almost a century, you just sort of lose some of that. So Sinkwich, Trippey, hard for me to contextualize exactly what they were. Other people might say like a Bailey or whatever else, but I think that Chubb was really, 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 really good at Georgia. Better, I would say better than Todd Gurley, more meaningful in some respects. And I think Pollock is on there for me, not just because he's a 3-time All-American, but also because he was representative of a pretty good era for Georgia football. The early 2000s was a little bit of a resurrection for the Georgia program. And I would say that telling the football history of Georgia requires talking about the Richt era to a certain extent. And so having a guy like Pollock on there representative of that, I think makes some sense too. So I would say that your 3 ought to be Herschel, Bowers, and Pollock. And I would say that your 4th could possibly be up for some debate. Let us see what else. Mark Goodman says Pollock could also change a game with one play. You could always count on him in the clutch. Mark, you're right about that. Octavius Oliver also remembering all the catches that Brock Bowers made against Alabama back when he was a freshman. You're right. He also had like 13 or 14 touchdowns that year. That's a massive total. That is a massive, massive total. Matt Rukavina says you got to have Stetson Bennett on there. No way you can't have the back-to-back national champ quarterback. Fair argument. All right, let me go through. Let me go to DawgNation.com. We'll do a few comments there. All right, on DawgNation here just for a moment, then we'll get ready to wrap it up. Once I get in. All right, on DawgNation here for a couple of comments before we get ready to go for a weekend here. Slowly but surely, now we're getting there. Good to see Rambo in here today. Drum Dog says the Bowers catch from Bennett on the final drive against Ohio State was my favorite. It's certainly a very good one. BA's fresh pullover. Thank you very much. So that's the second username we've had related to an article of clothing for me. We've had BA's cardigan in the YouTube comment section. Now we got BA's fresh pullover, which is very funny. He says, the most important dog ever is Kirby Smart, period. No doubt about that. Let's see what else. Somebody said there's confusion about Brinson. Are people saying he may leave? I don't know. I'm hopeful that he comes back. PDT brings up a really good point that, unfortunately, we have a pretty prime example of a Georgia player, putting Georgia in a pretty tough situation with Raylan Wilson on the touchdown on the, little running back route. And, I mean, I talk to people who know people, and, I do believe that was a play that Georgia was ready for. that was a play that Georgia had been practicing for all week long. And young linebackers are being coached to be in the right position when that play was called. And I'm led to believe that Wilson did kind of freeze up on that. But you didn't certainly, hear any kind of like sort of public finger pointing in his direction. You're right about that, because that's just not what Kirby Smart does. When you're self-assured, you don't need to shift blame. And Kirby Smart has never needed to do that. I believe you're right. Monkster says maybe Dog Nation can offer me a bobblehead doll. I wouldn't mind that. Roger Hall says, I couldn't disagree with Herschel's politics more, but I was 5 years old the first time that I saw Herschel play. He made me a Dogs fan. He was and still is the greatest running back ever to play the college game, and maybe the best college player ever. I'll always love him. And Roger, I think there's something really important in that. And look, here's the one thing I really believe is that people come to Georgia football with all kinds of different backgrounds, And people have differences of belief, and those beliefs matter. It's important to decide what you believe about life and how you believe things ought to be. Away from college football, belief is important. It's important to have beliefs. And yet I do think that sports, and I know this is trite and it's kind of corny, but I believe this there as well. There is also something to be said for, I can treat sports as sports, and I think we're better for that, whether it be someone who's, in keeping with your beliefs or someone who's against your beliefs, to sort of see that sports figure as a sports figure. I think there's some real value in that. I really do. And, this is not a door that always opens just in the same direction. There's multiple examples of that. Well, this guy has expressed this belief, this guy's expressed that belief, but I think we're all better off within sports. Makes us better, first of all, I believe. I think something about sports just makes us more grounded as people, and the ability to judge an athlete or a coach as an athlete or a coach and not something else. I just think it keeps us a little bit healthy, keeps us a little bit sane. So, Roger, I think your words are well stated, and I really appreciate that. Larry Goldberg says, I need to school Connor on how hard it was to get SEC teams voted to compete in the championship game back in the 70s and 80s. Yeah. I mean, this is a little bit before my time, but there was, I think, a pretty significant bias against Southern teams for a long time in these polls. Also, somebody pointing out that the new Kansas State offensive coordinator is named Connor Riley, which is kind of interesting. Randy Hall wondering about the next Marlowe's event. I'm not sure, Randy. Hopefully we'll get a chance to get together on some of that. I do believe that some of our promotion staff may be going into off-season mode here for a little bit. Just to be totally honest with you, sort of pre-cruise, we may have a little bit of an off-season mode for some of our promotion staff around here. Nick Nikoloff asking about a Stetson Bennett update. That'd be a good idea. I don't have anything personally new to provide. I have talked to a few people who've talked to Stetson. It seems like he's doing pretty well. But on the first-person perspective on that, I don't have anything new to provide other than I have talked to a few people, and they seem to report kind of good things. Rambo says, regarding our later round NFL draft prospects, it seems a lot will depend on their measurables at the combine. I would believe that's probably true. And, in terms of, their readiness to leave, it's also a matter of, well, how much can I make by going to the NFL versus how much could I make if I stay here? And, that's a real decision. It's a real decision. Some guys are just sort of ready for the NFL. If you've dreamed of the NFL, the idea that you could be one step away from, achieving that dream, that's a pretty big draw at a certain point, I would say. Frank says that Herschel would have been a great tight end. He says Bowers would have been a great running back. Or says it would have been a good running back. They're both great dogs, though. Yeah, I think that's right. Roger Hall says that we're liberals, conservatives, and everything in between, but we're all dogs. And that really is true. And, Roger, I take it very seriously, the need not to point too much of that kind of stuff out, because people want to break from all that from sometimes. But from my perspective of where I sit doing the show every day, you just wouldn't believe how true I see that to be. I mean, like, Georgia football is a very big tent. There are a lot of people that come here from all kinds of backgrounds. And I'm just content to sort of let that be and not even talk about the things that people sometimes think about when they're not thinking about Georgia football. And obviously, I'm not an idiot, hopefully. I understand that other things besides this are important. But I believe that my job, even though other things are important, it is important for me to give people a break from that. And I don't, Georgia football is not the only thing I think about, but it's going to be the only thing I talk about, and at least professionally speaking. And so I think that's people what come to expect from me. But I don't expect that, Georgia football is always the only thing you have on your mind. When there's big things going on in the news, I'm assuming that you're thinking about it. You should probably assume that I'm thinking about it. But I take very, very seriously the idea of we're going to treat this, as what you've come to expect it to be. You're not going to walk into a burger joint and have me serve up some sushi. We're going to try to deliver what you've come to expect. Let's see what else. BA's Fresh Pullover says, do you think we have a top 10 NFL draft wide receiver prospect in this team? No, I don't. But as I said before, a couple of things that we're going to wrap it up after this. As long as Georgia's getting the production that it's getting, I think you're sort of okay with that. And I also believe this. When you compare, say, wide receiver to another important position group, because wide receiver is a very important position group. When you compare that to another important position group, like, say, defensive line, I don't know why this is. Someone smarter than me would need to explain why this is. But there seems to be an ability to produce great offense without great recruiting. In a way, there is not the ability to produce great defense without great recruiting. I believe, and I don't have the numbers to back this up, but I'm pretty sure I could find them. I believe that recruiting is just more important for producing great defenses than it is for producing great offenses. Look how many of these Big 12 teams over the years have scored 1 million points. Most of them don't have any 4-star prospects of any kind, but they are able to scheme up something that's pretty effective. Great defense over the course of time. I'm talking about truly great defense, not just low scoring because you play against bad offenses, but truly great defenses almost always seem to correlate with great recruiting in a way that does not perhaps seem to be true for the offensive side of the ball. All right. Garrison Soul says that modern athletes are just better the closer you get to modern times. I don't doubt that's being true, but I also don't know that should matter in this particular discussion. I really don't. For instance, baseball fan. When you think about the exploits of a Willie Mays or a Mickey Mantle or some of those guys from the 1950s, I don't think those guys are any less impressive because they may be less athletic than guys today. In a weird way, athleticism is not really what I watch sports for. Now, I obviously you're entertained by great athletes, but the exploits that matter to me are not necessarily the most athletic parts of it, like how fast they run, how high they jump, things like that. I mean, some of that's obviously what this is, but also some of it's just sort of the natural, I don't even know what I'm trying to say, natural flair for how the game is played, or the feats themselves. I don't know, and this is true across all sports because I am a pretty big sports fan. I mean, people always kind of talk about what the NBA used to be like, and say the Bob Cousy era, and I do get that. Very, very different sport altogether. But I don't know that makes guys from that era any less impressive. I don't know that it does. If Bill Russell was playing today, how good would he be? I don't know. But how good he was in his own era is, to me, the only thing that matters, I guess. Does that make sense? But now Devian Arrow brings up a pretty good point, which is Herschel may be one of the few guys whose natural athleticism does transcend 40 years worth. That, I mean, if you've seen Herschel in recent years, I mean, he's still as rocked up as can be. I mean, oh my gosh. But certainly the kind of athlete he was then, a little bit more in keeping with what we've kind of come to expect from athletes right now. That's a pretty good point, actually. All right, we're going to go for now. All right, good stuff, y'all. I appreciate it. Y'all have a great weekend. Stay close to Dog Nation because there's probably more stuff coming. Some of this draft stuff may trickle out slowly over time because the players do have a few more days to do this. You never know. Also, All-American Bowl in San Antonio this weekend. That should be interesting. So there's a lot going on. Y'all stay close to Dog Nation for all of that. And check out RS Andrews online, rsandrews.com, for your air conditioning, heating, plumbing, and electric needs. They will show up on time. They'll do the work that's promised for the prices promised, including that heating system. People said this earlier. It's freezing cold. And if you want to get your heating system tuned back up to factory fresh specs, make sure it stays functioning well for you all winter long, keeping you toasty and warm. Our friends at RS Andrews have got you covered on that. It may only cost you $99, so find them online today. rsandrews.com. Have a great day. We'll see you back here Monday. Dog Nation Daily, presented by Kroger. We'll look forward to then.